Welcome back to the deep dive. We are, as always, taking some really intense paradigm-shifting source material,
Mhm.
trying to pull out the essential knowledge and deliver insights that you can, well, hopefully use to stay informed and maybe even a little surprised.
And today, we're jumping into a question that is about as foundational as it gets. It's about value itself. What is it, and where does it even come from?
Yeah, it's the kind of thing that physicists for a long time just sort of pushed to the side. There's this great quote from Eugen Wigner, the physicist, where he asks, where in the Schrödinger equation do you put the joy of being alive?
It's the perfect question, isn't it? I mean, the equations are incredible. They describe matter and energy flawlessly, but they leave out the entire reason we care. They leave out the experience, the meaning, the sheer value of it all.
And that quote just perfectly sets up the mission for this deep dive. We are going to be challenging what is probably the most comfortable, the most common assumption in, well, in modern thought.
Which is that values, the things we hold highest, like truth or goodness or beauty, that they're basically just human inventions,
Right.
that they're secondary. They're just add-ons that we project onto a universe that is, at its core, cold, meaningless, and just there, after consciousness happens to bubble up by accident.
Exactly. The standard materialist worldview tells us the universe is fundamentally neutral, and we're the ones who come along and, color it in. But the source material we're looking at today argues the complete opposite.
It flips it entirely.
It flips it. It says value is not invented, it's not projected, it is in fact discovered and disclosed. The argument is that value is intrinsic to reality. It's a constitutive element of the cosmos itself, just as fundamental as, say, space or time or even consciousness.
Okay, so that's a huge claim. If value is already baked into the fabric of the universe, then what's the role of life? Why do we need organisms, consciousness, human attention at all? Life becomes the essential mechanism for that value to be disclosed, for it to be appreciated. The value is present, but it needs a kind of receptacle, a lens, to be brought into existence as an experienced quality.
Can you give us an example?
Sure, think about a huge, towering mountain range, the mountain itself. It doesn't have the capacity for appreciation, it can't value anything, but its geological structure, its scale, its sheer existence, that absolutely has value.
As a resource, maybe, or a challenge?
Or as a source of majesty and awe, right? But only for creatures who can perceive it. Life doesn't create the value. It's the universe's way of realizing the value that's already inherent within its own structure.
That is a very subtle but a really crucial distinction.
It is. Life, in this view, is this continuous process of cosmic consciousness discovering and furthering its own implicit beauty, its own truth, its own goodness. And this isn't so strange if you accept the idea that awareness or consciousness is foundational to the universe in the first place.
An idea from thinkers like Schelling or even some contemporary scientists.
Right, like Henry Stapp, Thies, Kafatos. If awareness is primary, then the process of discovering value isn't some bizarre cosmic accident. It's actually the fundamental purpose of the universe's evolution.
And this foundational claim, right out of the gate, sets up a pretty profound critique of how modern science has historically dealt with value, or, more accurately, how it's refused to.
Yeah, we need to be really clear on the two main reasons our sources give for why science struggles so much with this. The first one is basically methodological. It's exclusion.
Okay, what do you mean by exclusion?
Well, to be objective, science spent centuries systematically purging its methods of anything subjective. So any consideration of value, emotion, purpose, all of it was thrown out.
And the result is predictable.
Completely predictable. If you design a method that excludes value from the start, you are guaranteed to find no value in the world your method reveals. It's a self-fulfilling, circular argument. The primary mistake is treating value as this secondary thing, the subjective coating we paint on afterward, instead of seeing that the impulse toward value, especially truth, is primary to existence itself.
And then, when science does decide to look at something that seems valuable, like a moral impulse or an aesthetic choice, it commits the second error, which is reduction.
Yes. The reductionist impulse is to try and explain everything complex by breaking it down into something it assumes is more fundamental. So it tries to explain goodness in terms of, biological utility or social contracts.
Or beauty in terms of reproductive fitness.
Exactly. But for ultimate values, there is nothing more fundamental. When you try to reduce something like consciousness or ultimate value, you don't explain it. You explain it away. You miss its irreducible nature entirely. It's like trying to understand the flavor of coffee by just listing its chemical components.
You lose the very thing you were trying to study. And that reductionist impulse, Explaining the higher in terms of the lower,
Yeah,
it always ends up devaluing the thing it's looking at.
always.
So this brings us to the roadmap for this whole deep dive. We're working with two huge primary claims. First, that value, truth, goodness, beauty is a constitutive part of the cosmos. And second,
And second, that the right hemisphere of the brain, the RH, is best suited to disclose this intrinsic value. It does this through its relational, holistic, and receptive way of paying attention.
while the left hemisphere, the LH, with its focus on manipulation and analysis, it actually risks corrupting or even destroying that value through misunderstanding and reduction.
Exactly. We're going to be examining why the world disclosed by the right hemisphere is a world that is just pregnant with meaning and value, and why the world disclosed by the left hemisphere is, well, it's often just a pile of meaningless parts.
Okay, let's try to unpack this enormous claim, starting with what might be the most elusive pillar of them all, truth.
All right, section 1.
So we have to start with this deep paradox that sits right at the heart of modern science. On the one hand, science itself, our absolute pinnacle of intellectual achievement, is driven by the ultimate value of truth. I mean, it's seen as essential, timeless, something that demands sacrifice.
And yet, on the other hand, the cultural assumption that surrounds scientific objectivity is often this absolute avoidance of implying any inherent meaning in the cosmos.
It's a total internal contradiction.
It is. You have scientists who dedicate their entire lives, often in total obscurity, to uncovering facts because they believe implicitly that the truth matters. But they're operating under a philosophical premise that says the universe, in the end, is completely pointless. If you dare suggest that some kind of cosmic meaning motivates your work, you risk being dismissed as unscientific.
So we have to ask the really basic question. If the universe really is meaningless, where does that overwhelming intuition that truth is important, that it commands our allegiance, where does that actually come from?
Well, the answer from materialism is just not very satisfying. It suggests our fierce allegiance to truth is just a convenient evolutionary byproduct, a habit of mind that just happened to be useful for survival.
But the value of truth itself can't be empirically verified. You have to assume it's valuable from the start.
You have to assume it a priori. We trust it implicitly. But why? I mean, if maximizing utility is the only ultimate biological goal, why would we ever pursue a painful, inconvenient truth over a comfortable, beneficial lie?
Right. This is the critical moment in the argument. If the universe is meaningless, shouldn't maximizing happiness or utility just trump the pursuit of objective truth, which would be difficult, even dangerous?
Exactly. I mean, imagine a scenario where some carefully constructed, widely accepted narrative, a lie, actually leads to peace and prosperity, the greatest happiness for the greatest number. In a purely utilitarian calculation, that lie wins.
And yet we know, just instinctively, that there's something deeply wrong with that conclusion.
Deeply wrong. The source material suggests that truth has to matter more than utility because it's an ultimate non-instrumental value. It can't be reduced to anything else. The moment you define truth as merely what is useful, it stops being truth. It just becomes a tool.
So accepting truth as an ultimate value requires us to accept a cosmos that is, what, pregnant with meaning, something that's soliciting our allegiance?
Demanding us to strive for coherence with it, yes, rather than just getting by. And this utilitarian reduction of truth, it also casts a huge shadow of doubt on our own faculty of reason.
How so?
Well, if our capacity for rationality is just a tool that evolved for getting by, or even more cynically, a weapon for winning arguments and manipulating social status, regardless of whether those arguments are factually correct,
Then why on earth should we ever trust our own reason to disclose ultimate reality?
you shouldn't. The usefulness of reason for survival doesn't guarantee its truth-disclosing capacity at all. We trust reason because we intuitively believe the cosmos has some coherence, some meaning, and that we are an expression of that coherence. Without that initial act of faith and meaning, the entire intellectual enterprise, science, philosophy, law, it all just crumbles.
The materialist explanation requires you to take a leap of faith to trust the very mechanism that tells you to distrust faith.
It eats its own tail. It's a complete paradox.
So if truth isn't just a tool or a list of facts we possess, how should we be thinking about it?
The definition here shifts truth from something we have to something we do. It becomes an act, specifically an act of trust or faithfulness. This is rooted in the Old English word troth.
As in, to pledge your troth.
Exactly. When two people pledge their troth, they are committing to being truthful to one another. So truth, in this sense, defines the proper faithful relationship between consciousness and the world it perceives. When we commit to truth, we're committing to something outside of ourselves, something we acknowledge as inherently valuable.
And that idea of commitment immediately connects us to this concept of the nexus of values, this web where they all hold each other up.
Absolutely. The act of faithfulness implies that loyalty and connection have value in themselves. That's goodness. And it implies that the something else we're being faithful to, the cosmos, also has intrinsic value, that it coheres as a beautiful whole.
So truth, goodness, and beauty aren't three separate pillars standing on a foundation of dead matter.
No, they cohere. They form a foundational nexus. They sustain one another like threads in a complex fabric. You can't just pull one out without damaging the whole structure.
And the source gives an example of what happens when this allegiance to truth is just fundamentally absent. It points to the psychopath.
Yeah, and it's a powerful example. Psychopaths show this profound lack of allegiance to truth. They often lie gratuitously for no reason, not for any immediate utility or gain. It seems like they almost enjoy the sheer exercise of deception itself.
And this behavior, along with their total lack of love, trust, empathy, it's correlated with severe right hemisphere dysfunction.
Which powerfully illustrates the point that allegiance to truth is fundamentally a relational, emotional, and dispositional requirement. It's rooted in our capacity for connection, which is an RH specialty. It's not just a cognitive calculation carried out by the left hemisphere.
So the perception of truth isn't just intellectual. It relies on emotional intelligence, on wisdom.
Oh, absolutely. The perception of value, whether it's truth or goodness, is based in emotional intelligence and what Aristotle called practical wisdom, or phronosis. And this perception happens precognitively.
Before any analysis kicks in.
Way before. We perceive value instantaneously, much like we perceive the color red or the key of a piece of music. It's an immediate, intuitive apprehension.
There's a beautiful parallel in the German language here. The word for perception is Wahrnehmung, which literally means truth-taking.
And the philosopher Max Scheler took that and introduced a parallel term, Wahrnehmung, which means value-taking.
Okay, so what was Scheller's point with that?
Scheler argued that value is a gestalt. It's a primal phenomenon. You can't break it down into its constituent parts without losing its essence. You can't understand why a joke is funny by analyzing its grammar or word choice.
Right, you kill the joke.
You kill it. The value of the joke, its funniness, is apprehended instantly as a whole, as gestalt. If you try to analyze value into parts, you discard the very phenomenon you were trying to study in the first place. We apprehend the unanalyzed whole of a situation and its value at a glance, and that process, that's what we call wisdom.
Which puts the right hemisphere, the master of holistic, intuitive, gestalt perception, right in the driver's seat for perceiving value. But we still haven't fully explored the role of affection in all this. There's that powerful statement, one knows nothing save what one loves.
And this is key. True understanding, especially of complex living systems, requires a certain disposition towards the object of your study. It demands an initial connection. This is the essence of what's called the hermeneutic circle.
Which says,
to truly understand something, you must already presuppose some kind of connection, a disposition. Our source calls it a step of faith. You can only really gain knowledge from the inside. Indifference, or worse, antipathy, just blinds you.
and this is a radical break from the ideal of cold, clinical Western objectivity, which strives for complete detachment.
It is. I mean, look at the examples our source cites. 3 foundational intellectual figures of the last century and a half, Darwin, Marx, and Freud. They all achieved incredible insights, but their methodology often demanded an emotional distance that, well, bordered on contempt.
Freud, working with patients in terrible distress, admitted he had no patience at all with lunatics and called neurotics rabble that you could learn from.
And Marx, the supposed champion of the working class, privately called workers and peasants asses and rabble.
And even Darwin, who clearly loved the natural world as a young man, later lamented that his mind had become a kind of machine for grinding general laws out of large collections of facts. He said the scientific man ought to have no wishes, no affections, a mere heart of stone.
That pursuit of knowledge through detachment, it often required a profound loss of connection and feeling. It's characteristic of the left hemisphere's desire to isolate, categorize, and study an object while denying any real relationship to it.
And you contrast this with, what was the Japanese term?
Kansatsu. It's often used for scientific observation, but it implies a relational gaze. The syllable kan suggests a one-bodiness or a co-presence with the thing you're observing. Knowledge and connection aren't seen as mutually exclusive, they're mutually dependent.
It all comes back to St. Augustine's point.
Yeah.
One must love them in order to know them.
Mhm.
Love isn't blinding you to reality. It's the prerequisite for the door to understanding to even open.
Even Nietzsche, surprisingly, emphasized this. He said that to understand music or any profound subject, you need effort, patience, gentleness, a goodwill to tolerate it in spite of its strangeness. Only after that kind of dedicated, affectionate attention does the object shed its veil and reveal its indescribable beauty.
So without that initial disposition of affection, the door to any essential holistic understanding just stays closed. And all you're left with is the detached and often destructive abstraction that the left hemisphere's analytical machine offers up.
And that abstraction is exactly where the error happens. As Scheller pointed out, the scholar abstracts away the value quality and then mistakenly assumes that the value-free fact is the more fundamental reality. They throw away the gestalt, and then they're left desperately trying to invent some external standard, some yardstick or norms to artificially glue back the value distinctions they just threw away.
And that yardstick is almost always utility, which transitions us perfectly into the second pillar of value, goodness.
Let's talk about goodness.
Okay, so we've established the argument that goodness is constitutive, it's real, and it's disclosed by the right hemisphere. Now we need to look at how the left hemisphere tries to account for morality, which, the argument goes, inevitably leads to its corruption. And that system is utilitarianism.
Utilitarianism is just. It's so profoundly appealing to the left hemisphere. You can see why. It tries to reduce the incredibly complex, ambiguous, messy reality of moral experience to a system of quantifiable, measurable outcomes.
Maximizing the greatest happiness of the greatest number.
Exactly. It perfectly aligns with the LH's governing desire to manipulate, to control, to quantify the environment. It strips out the essential interiority of morality, the question of what an action does to the actor, and replaces it with measurable externalities. It basically turns ethics into an accounting problem.
And this isn't just philosophical conjecture. There's some really strong neuroscientific evidence that supports this hemispheric divide in how we make ethical judgments.
Oh, absolutely. The right hemisphere is the principal substrate for morality. It has to be, because it manages the core components of any ethical action: social and emotional understanding, what's called theory of mind.
And a coherent sense of self over time.
Right, an agency, that profound sense of owning your actions and your intentions.
So what happens if you experimentally disable the RH's ability to process morality?
The studies are incredibly revealing. When researchers use techniques like transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS, to experimentally suppress key areas in the right hemisphere, especially the right temporoparietal junction, the RTPJ, they temporarily disrupt a person's ability to process intention and context.
And the result?
The subjects suddenly make dramatically more utilitarian judgments.
They stop considering the moral context, the why behind the act, and they just focus on the measurable outcome, the consequence.
Precisely. In these moral dilemma experiments, suppressing the RH makes a subject see an accidental poisoning, which has a bad outcome, as morally worse than a failed murder attempt, which had a terrible intention but a good outcome. The RH is critical for relational moral reasoning. Utilitarian decisions, on the other hand, are often driven by cold, abstract reasoning and cost-benefit analysis, processes that are largely unaided or even opposed by our emotional responses.
The character traits that are associated with people who prioritize these cold, utilitarian judgments, they're really striking.
They paint a pretty concerning picture, yeah. Study after study shows that subjects who gravitate toward purely utilitarian judgments tend to have emotional blunting, lower empathy, higher Machiavellianism, psychopathy, and often a greater sense of the meaninglessness of life.
So the academic assumption that utilitarianism is the most rational or superior moral framework, it leads to a really uncomfortable conclusion.
A deeply uncomfortable one.
Yeah.
It leads you to conclude that the individuals who are least prone to moral errors, according to this calculus, also happen to possess psychological traits that most of us would consider prototypically amoral. The inclination toward utilitarianism is often driven by a detached, calculating, and egoist outlook, not some profound concern for the greater good.
Which brings us right to those abstract thought experiments, the famous ones like the trolley problem, or the scenario where a doctor is debating whether to harvest a healthy visitor's organs to save 5 dying patients.
Right. They're all designed to force you into a purely rational choice, one that maximizes utility even if it feels morally repulsive.
And the fact that moral philosophers can seriously, clinically, conclude that the doctor should kill the innocent visitor, it suggests a profound disconnect between their abstract system and actual human morality.
It really does. These thought experiments, which are a favorite of the left hemisphere, they fail in several crucial ways when you try to apply them to the richness of reality. The first failure is that they are just completely unrealistically circumscribed. They strip away all context and complexity.
To the point of absurdity.
Totally. They ignore the profound moral damage inflicted on the perpetrator. What does it do to me as a coherent, spiritual, emotional being to become the person who pushed the man onto the tracks or murdered an innocent patient? Utilitarianism just ignores that my moral integrity, my character, is itself a vital part of the calculus.
And it ignores the wider cascading consequences for society, like the total collapse of trust in the medical profession if doctors suddenly become known as potential organ harvesters.
Exactly. And you're always asked to assume perfect certainty in these scenarios. You have to assume the man on the tracks will definitely stop the trolley, or that the organs will definitely save all 5 patients.
Which is never the case in real life.
Never. Real-life moral judgments are made in a context of inherent uncertainty. They require practical wisdom, not theoretical certainty. When you stipulate these unreal certainties, you're not testing human morality anymore, you're just testing a theoretical machine. You're being asked to blind yourself to the crucial ambiguity that defines real-world moral action.
And that ambiguity is something the right hemisphere is far better equipped to handle than the left, which just craves closure and control.
The LH sees people as discrete units of utility. The RH, on the other hand, sees humans as individuals who exist over time, held together by a coherent narrative embedded in a complex web of social relationships, fully embodied and emotionally complex. And it's this fullness of being that leads us to make so-called irrational choices, like valuing the sacredness of an individual life over maximizing material consequences, or prioritizing justice over a cold calculus.
Okay, so if these rule-based systems, whether it's deontology based on duty or utilitarianism based on outcomes, if they inevitably break down when duty's conflict or consequences are impossible to fully predict, what's the superior, more human approach to ethics?
We have to move beyond systems that offer the price of certainty, which, as we've seen, often just yields absurdity, and instead seek the prize of uncertainty, which is wisdom.
And the framework for that is virtue ethics.
Yes. Virtue ethics shifts the focus entirely. It stops focusing on rules and outcomes and instead focuses on the moral character and the disposition of the actor. It's a focus on being a good person rather than just doing the right thing according to a rule book.
There's that great quote from Meister Eckhart, "Do not think to place holiness in doing. We should place holiness in being, for it is not the works that sanctify us, but we who should sanctify the works." The moral quality is internal first.
And virtue ethics requires judgment and practical wisdom for gnosis. These are concepts that are inherently capable of navigating complexity and going beyond rigid, abstract rules. It acknowledges that morality is a nexus of interconnected virtues, not a single causal chain. The danger, as the philosopher Sartre noted, lies in abstraction. He said, evil is the systematic substitution of the abstract for the concrete.
That's a powerful idea. When people commit callous crimes, especially under the banner of some systematic ideology, they often comfort themselves that they're acting out of noble motives.
Exactly. They substitute an abstract principle, historical destiny, racial purity, whatever it is, for the concrete inhumanity of their actions right in front of them. They apply theoretical rules without any contextual awareness or emotional connection, which is pure LH dysfunction. True virtue requires humility and relational awareness. It's a state of being, not a checklist of deeds.
So if morality is intuitive and rooted in character, does that mean that humans are inherently cooperative? Does it contradict that common reductionist view that all altruism must just be covert selfishness?
The evidence strongly suggests that, yes, humans are intuitively cooperative. Prosocial behavior often comes from a genuine impulse of its own. In fact, some research indicates that it often requires mental effort and conscious calculation to override that initial impulse and act selfishly, the exact opposite of the cynical model.
So the default setting is honesty and cooperation.
Surprisingly, it seems to be. And the research on cynicism is really persuasive here.
Tell us about that.
Well, cynicism, that pervasive negative belief that self-interest is the only thing that drives all human behavior, is consistently associated with worse physical health, poorer psychological and economic well-being, and maybe most counterintuitively, it's correlated with lower intelligence and education.
That is counterintuitive.
It is. Competent, educated adults tend to be skeptical only when it's warranted. Less competent individuals are more likely to adopt cynicism as an all-purpose coping strategy to avoid being vulnerable or feeling like they've been duped.
So ultimately, moral action is about co-creating the kind of world we want to live in. The source puts it as, we act altruistically because I don't want to live in a world where...
Right, you don't turn your back on someone in need because that decision is part of co-creating a world where that kind of callousness is acceptable. Goodness is an active, ongoing participation in the world's value structure, and that's disclosed by the relational sensibility of the RH, which provides a critical check against the LH's corrosive, isolating calculus.
And this emphasis on disposition, on character, on the inner sense of the good, it leads us naturally to the final value, which is maybe the one that most elegantly and forcefully resists that reductionist impulse: beauty.
Right, the problem of beauty.
So the reductionist materialist account faces this enormous hurdle when it tries to explain beauty. The usual move is to claim it's all instrumental, that it's primarily about sexual selection. But that explanation is just fundamentally incomplete.
The problem isn't explaining how beauty might be used once it exists, but explaining where the sense of beauty came from in the first place. Darwin himself admitted this was a very obscure subject. Evolutionary psychology can only really answer, given that we find X attractive, how might finding X attractive be used to our advantage?
But it can't explain the deep, non-functional reason we find things attractive at all.
No. Why do we find the elegant, complex shapes of plants and trees beautiful when that specific elegance offers no extra utility to us or to the insects that pollinate them? The idea that all natural beauty, the vastness of a mountain range, the crystal structure of ice, the curve of a shell, is purely an informational signal about reproductive health is just. It's not sufficient to explain the depth and breadth of human aesthetic experience.
And the whole idea of beauty as a surplus, a luxury that we only indulge in after utility is taken care of, that's just contradicted by human history itself.
It is. Our source material cites compelling evidence from early tool-making. As soon as humans started making things, they started making beautiful things. Even 1.5 million years ago, early flint tools show evidence of being made by creative people who wanted them to be complicated and beautiful, not just functional.
That aesthetic impulse was there from the very beginning.
Long before it was strictly necessary for survival. And look at the history of technology. We often assume metallurgy began because people needed better weapons or tools. But the historical evidence suggests early metallurgy was driven primarily by the human desire for rare, precious, and aesthetically pleasing objects, the desire for beautiful gold and copper.
So the aesthetic impulse, intellectual curiosity, these non-practical motives were often the real stimulus for functional developments that might never have been conceived of otherwise. Beauty isn't marginal, it's fundamental.
It's an irreducible element of experience and often more fundamental than utility. And this takes us right back to Kant's famous definition of the aesthetic experience. Beauty pleases us disinterestedly.
Disinterestedly, meaning it has purposiveness without presenting any purpose. Zweckmäßigkeit ohne Vorstellung eines Zwecks.
Yes. He called it a form of affection or love that is different from desire. And this disinterested nature is critical. If beauty were instrumental, if you liked the painting because you could sell it for a profit or the flower because you could eat it, it would cease to be purely beautiful.
You can't command it or capture it with language or analyze it into submission.
No. As Emily Dickinson wrote, chase it, and it ceases. Chase it not, and it abides. It's elusive. It demands a certain receptive stance.
And the experience of beauty often goes beyond just pleasure. It connects to the sublime. Rilke said beauty is nothing but the onset of terror we can only just bear.
That's right. True beauty doesn't just comfort you, it often forces you to confront something vast and beyond your control. That confrontation with the transcendent, the awareness of something greater than ourselves, confirms that the experience isn't just about comfortable, consumerist pleasure.
And while so many people claim beauty is purely subjective, just culturally relative, the evidence for its universality is pretty remarkable.
It really is. You see striking cross-cultural agreement on aesthetic preferences. The anecdote about the Amazonian tribesmen is particularly profound. They were shown a video of Maria Callas, an icon of Western opera, singing Bellini's Costa Diva.
And this music was completely foreign to their culture.
Totally foreign, yet they were completely rapt, moved to awe. An elder commented, "Without understanding her, we sense that there is something sacred there. That suggests beauty taps into some universal structure, a shared fundamental language."
And even more simply, studies show that babies, as young as 72 hours old, will preferentially look at faces that adults rate as attractive.
which suggests beauty is an archetype, not just a learned prototype that you develop through cultural exposure.
So if beauty is intrinsic to the universe, this native tongue of the cosmos, what makes the right hemisphere so good at disclosing it?
The essence of beauty is harmony. It's the appreciation of relations between things that are simultaneously similar and yet different, creating a tension that resolves into coherence. And this relational, holistic mode of understanding is the core strength of the RH.
And the cerebral studies back this up.
They do. Lesion studies, functional imaging, they all suggest the right hemisphere is the primary locus of beauty appreciation in over 90% of cases. The intact brain's aesthetic preferences align very closely with the RH's worldview. A preference for the gestalt, seeing the whole thing at once.
An affinity for the ambiguous, the unexpected.
Exactly. Its implicit, embodied nature and its fundamental irreducibility. The Navajos have a great distinction between hard eyes, the sharp, defined, grasping gaze of the LH, which is focused on acquisition, and soft eyes, the broad, open, receptive gaze of the RH, which is focused on appreciation.
And the LH tends to prefer simple perfection and symmetry, the aesthetic of efficiency and control. But true, profound beauty often lives in the aesthetics of imperfection.
That's a key distinction. The LH is drawn to simple, tall, narrow shapes, which is the look of most modern, functional, urban architecture. True beauty, however, often involves a coupling of symmetry with asymmetry, of perfection with imperfection.
The golden ratio is a perfect example of this, right?
It is. The golden ratio, which underlies so much of natural growth in classical art, isn't simple symmetry. It incorporates asymmetry into its symmetrical structure. And the two key regions of the brain that respond most strongly to these canonical divider proportions, they're located in the right hemisphere, the right occipitotemporal and right parietal areas. The RH is attracted to that subtle, complex relationship of proportions.
And this deep appreciation for transience, for imperfection, for age, it's crystallized in non-Western aesthetics, like the Japanese concept of wabi-sabi.
Wabi-sabi is the idealization of the transient, the imperfect, the incomplete, the broken. It evokes a sense of serene melancholy and spiritual longing, connecting us to the flow of nature and process. It's the total opposite of the LH's search for eternal, reproducible perfection.
And this is embodied in the art of kintsugi.
Beautifully embodied. Kintsugi is the Japanese art of repairing broken pottery by highlighting the cracks with gold lacquer. Instead of hiding the damage, the repair is celebrated. The flaw becomes a unique part of the object's beauty, its history, its story.
The golden lines of the repair transform the flaw into a feature.
It illustrates that the greatest beauty is often found not in original perfection, but in the process of healing and existence. And this requires a gaze that accepts transience and process. For this kind of beauty to declare itself, you can't just shine the harsh, bright beam of the intellect's spotlight on it.
Why is that bright light of analysis so detrimental to beauty?
Because beauty inherently depends on contrast and on shadows. As the writer Junichiro Tanizaki argued in his book In Praise of Shadows, were it not for shadows, there would be no beauty. The LH's spotlight seeks to force the implicit into explicit, measured parts, and in doing so, it effectively kills the atmosphere, the mystery, the gestalt that allows beauty to live. Beauty needs that tension between light and dark.
And this tension is also what gives rise to the sublime, that experience of something so vast its limits are unknown. It relies on the interrelation of presence and absence, what one scholar called a targeted absence.
Precisely. And the latest neuroscientific studies of the sublime confirmed that the two specific areas of the cortex involved are, once again, located in the right hemisphere. The emotion associated with the sublime is awe, which is fundamentally Rilke's terrifying beauty. All three of these values, beauty, goodness, truth, they rely on their dipolar nature. They need foils, shadows, contrast to fully declare themselves as a coherent nexus.
So beauty isn't an accident. It's not a human delusion. It's a constitutive element of the cosmos, what our source powerfully calls our native tongue. And there's one final fascinating connection between apprehending beauty and our capacity for action.
Yes, there's a clear link in the brain. The right anterior insula, which is an area heavily involved in appreciating beauty, emotional understanding, and social cognition, is also involved in initiating a change of behavior.
Meaning the experience of beauty isn't just passive contemplation, it moves us.
By beauty, we are moved to move. It compels action and change. It links the aesthetic directly to the ethical. So, to try and synthesize this really profound deep dive, we started by challenging this prevailing modern assumption that value is just a subjective human invention that we project onto a meaningless material reality.
And our sources argue, pretty compellingly, that value, truth, goodness, and beauty is actually intrinsic to reality. It's a foundational and constitutive component of the cosmos.
And we learn that the only way for us as conscious beings to properly apprehend and disclose this intrinsic value is through that relational, intuitive, and receptive mode of attention that is governed by the right hemisphere.
Whereas the reductionist account, which is driven by the left hemisphere's focus on utility, on measurement, on analytic decomposition, it just fails to make sense of any of these values.
It fails completely. This reduction turns truth into a mere weapon, it turns goodness into a cold and amoral calculus, and it turns beauty into nothing more than a mating signal. By fundamentally misunderstanding the nature of value, this model leads to its systemic devaluation and to the chaotic, unbalanced consequences we see all around us in the modern world.
So what does this realization mean for you, listening to this? If we accept this proposition, that beauty, goodness, and truth are objective aspects of reality that actively solicit our attention and demand our allegiance, and are not just things we arbitrarily invent, it demands a fundamental personal shift.
It does. It calls us to move our whole approach to knowledge away from cold, detached analysis and toward engaged affection and respect.
It means the highest moral or intellectual act isn't about calculating the perfect utilitarian outcome.
No, it's about adopting the right internal disposition. That open, humble, and receptive stance that allows the world's intrinsic value to declare itself through your consciousness. Understanding requires connection.
So consider that as a final provocative challenge.
Yeah.
What aspect of intrinsic value, truth, goodness, or beauty will you actively seek to disclose in the world today? Will you seek the harmony in the face of chaos, or will you choose the uncomfortable relational truth over the comforting, isolating lie? That's the question this deep dive leaves with you.
Thank you for joining us on this exploration of the very foundations of reality.
We really appreciate you taking the time for this deep dive. We'll talk to you next time.